speaker, Mr. Gilbert Buhari, Gilbert Buhari Kobina. Brother Kobina Buhari is a systemic theologian specializing in Pan-African religions from Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University. He was born in New York to Ghanaian parents. Some of us are already inherently, transnational. His parents are, and he, from the Anoa royal clan of Cape Coast, Ghana. Mr. Buhari sat on the Beyond Return Committee and was a contributor to the Year of Return proposal for Ghana. He is the founder of the God Box Foundation, God Box Tours, and he's currently the director of operations for the Pan-African Heritage World Museum, as well as the director of operations for PANAFEST. He's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Ghana and lectures at seminaries and universities in Ghana and the United States. Welcome, my brother. You will have the floor, but just before I do so, Sefo, I'm going to ask if you would please look up Ambassador Bennett's website and include it in the chat. I saw that there was a question concerning that. Thank you. Okay. Brother Buhari, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yaminase. Yananum so wase. The Nia Abaha, the Bibia Koduye. Give thanks and praises to the Most High and to the ancestors upon whose shoulders we stand. Honored to be here and honored to go right after our Ambassador Erica Bennett. I know her very well, and so I appreciate being on this panel. I was asked to be on this panel to give some sort of short context behind the Year of Return, how all of that came about, Beyond the Return, that we launched, and some of the incredible success that we had with the Year of Return, and some of the things that we can learn, other African countries can also learn from it as we move forward towards complete reconciliation and liberation for the entire Pan-African family. In 2015, after I had just come back from Ethiopia, at that point during my theological journey, I was looking for a spiritual home for all Black people. That was my thought process at the time, wondering what that would look like. And coming from Ethiopia in 2012, I learned a lot while I was in Ethiopia about Ghana, where I was from. And so in 2015, I wrote a proposal called the Pan-African Vision 2020. At the time, I felt like there was something, I had a sense that there was something coming. In 2020, something was going to happen and the Pan-African family would have to react. And so I wrote a proposal in 2015. I presented that to the PANAFEST board. With PANAFEST, many may know PANAFEST is one of the most consistently celebrated Pan-African festivals and platforms, in the entire world. I met with Rabbi Cohen and Dr. A.C. Sutherland and others, presented this proposal to them. And after, a couple of edits and changes, it was finally accepted. The proposal again was to establish Ghana as the spiritual home for all Black people. Again, coming from a theological background, my perspective was looking at Ghana and Ghana's history as it relates to Pan-Africanism. You have Ghana, again, being, the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to gain independence from colonial rule. We know that was very inspiring for the revolutionary struggles with oppressed people all over the world during the late 1950s and early 60s. We have our founder, really, first president, Asajafo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, one great Pan-African leader who put the Black Star on the Ghana flag, symbolizing Marcus Garvey and being inspired by the Black Star movement to return home to Africa. We have also in our history, many may know that during the Atlantic slave trade, majority of the slave ports in Africa were in Ghana. And so while many people may not have, many of the enslaved Africans may not have come from Ghana, many had to come through Ghana in order to get to the quote unquote New World. So all these things, put Ghana in a certain space. This is why Ghana, has a motto, the gateway into Africa, because it was literally the gateway out of Africa at the time. But most importantly, one of the things that was really important about Ghana, and I believe Honorable Ambassador Erica Bennett touched on it, is Ghana has in its constitution the right of abode, which allows for people, Africans, people of African descent or descendants of the Atlantic slave trade to gain dual citizenship and have a right to return, which really distinguishes Ghana in a lot of ways. And so when you think about it, all these things really position Ghana in a space where Ghana, from its very foundations as a country, was created to be a Pan-African nation. And that's, I think, is very important for this discussion, because it shows from its very foundations what Ghana was created to be and what the ideals of Ghana and its purpose and its responsibility towards children, its brothers and sisters and children in the diaspora. So all of that made sense for this proposal. It wasn't a hard sell because I was already dealing with incredible Pan-African leaders, as I mentioned, who had already been in the struggle for decades and understood the proposal. In 2016, it was approved, and I was given the go-ahead to sort of put together, start to mobilize faith groups. My focus was solely on the religious and spiritual aspects of Pan-Africanism, and so I started to meet up with certain faith leaders in 2016, asking them to mobilize their constituencies and getting prepared. At that time, the focus was 2020 and what we could do before then. Obviously, in 2016, there were a lot of things happening. This was, we're transitioning from President Obama going into the Trump administration. We remember the senseless killings of Black bodies during that time in that transition. Again, the context and the conditions surrounding that time is very important to know. Trump, in 2017, we started to hear about this acknowledgement of the 400 years since the first enslaved Africans had left the continent and come to the North America. And so immediately we started to hear something like that. We, there was a lot of controversy around that, but I remember I called Rabbi Cohen and others, and I immediately knew that we had to change the plans. We were initially looking at 2020, but this opportunity came, and we may have to start working a little earlier and maybe focus on 2019. Since it was something that was going to be a big deal, and it was a big deal. In fact, Once people started to hear about it, and it was confirmed that the U.S. was going to pass a bill called the H.R. 1242 bill that was going to acknowledge and commemorate the 400 years, it immediately opened up enormous possibilities. And so it became a lot bigger than what I had initially proposed in 2016. There was a lot of space where it wasn't just about the religious, cultural, and spiritual aspects, but there were a lot of social, political, and social economic possibilities that a lot of different sectors began to realize. And so what was interesting during this time, again, we talk about 2017 into 2018. One thing I do remember, and we don't speak about it a lot, but not only was, during the context of 2018, we had, the movie, The Black Panther, that came out, and which was pretty much single-handedly restored a sort of African pride and started to get folks, focusing in Africa. So all these things were playing out, and it seemed like, the spirit of our ancestors had erupted in a pretty interesting time. During this time, again, there were a lot of committees that were formed, Dr. Bennett, Rabbi Cohen, A.C. Sutherland, so many people involved in this. Dr. Ahmed Maulana, who worked tirelessly I'll be remiss if I don't mention him, for dual citizenship and others. There's so many people involved in really pushing this agenda. And once the government and our president specifically, President Akufo-Addo, put his name on it, it took off. We had folks also from the diaspora that also helped with the launching of the Year of Return in DC. People like Diallo Summers from the Adinkra group and others who really were instrumental in helping launch the Year of Return in Washington, DC in 2018. And once that happened, the rest was history. What was interesting about that was once we launched the Year of Return, it seemed to open up some wounds that we hadn't really anticipated. We started to recognize that there was a mutual suspicion that seemed to exist on both sides, those, Africans, African diasporans, and, as well as Africans on the continent. And Ghana, as I said, historically, once, the Pan-African spirit erupts, Ghana always seems to be in the forefront and has to take on these responsibilities again, because it's within our constitution to be responsible and to be a Pan-African nation. And so some of the wounds that came up, some of the discussions on both sides, we had African Americans, Africans in the diaspora, in the Caribbean and other places that were, a bit suspect about this call for returning, to Ghana and to the continent. What are we coming to Ghana for? What does Ghana have to offer us? Why? Well, Ghana sold us. The narrative, of course, again, is, Ghana sold us and Africans sold us. So what does Ghana want from us, or are they trying to exploit us? What is happening? So, that suspicion existed in many spaces in the diaspora on the continent, in Ghana especially, even though we understood our responsibilities. The narrative was a bit different. So we noticed that from the Ghana perspective, a lot of us weren't necessarily accepting the narrative that was coming, because again, a lot of the times we hear about slavery and being sold, but we don't speak more about the resistance of Africans and those that fought against the colonizers during that time, and families. And oftentimes I say, I hate the term, they sold us, because that immediately shows a distinction as if there are two groups rather than Africans selling themselves, knowing that this happened to us. This wasn't happening to a separate group of people. The diaspora, we became diasporans. And so we had to tackle these issues and have many dialogues, trying to make sure that we entered into each other's experiences in order to get a better understanding of each other and what we were about. And so during this time, one of the things that was pretty monumental was being able to go to the chiefs and the queen mothers, asking, our chiefs and queen mothers who owned the land to offer the land. So whilst the social political aspects were being handled by the Ghana government and offering dual citizenship, we wanted to also have the chiefs and the queen mothers, the traditional leaders, to also offer land to diasporans who were willing to come and invest in the country. And so this was some of the process that was going on. As we all know, the Year of Return eventually became quite a historic moment in history. I think almost 2 million diasporans came into the country that year. We had people were coming in and didn't even know why they were in Ghana. They just knew. It almost became, you had celebrities, you had so many people coming in, and almost became, a black, to almost emphasize your blackness. If you were black, you had to be on the continent, during that time. And that's what it became. And it was monumental. At that time, I actually brought Roland Martin at the end in December, asked him to come because I understood that, 10, 20, 30 years from now, this was the paradigm shift. This was what was it had changed the narrative. And because we were in it, we may not see it, but eventually we needed this documented. I asked Roland Martin to come in and interview the president of Ghana. He came through the God box, and I wanted that on record because I understood what this was about. And so in that same year in December, we launched the Beyond the Return. And again, Beyond the Return was not just about keeping the momentum going from the Year of Return, but it was also about extending this to other African nations. Because we understood Ghana, again, the gateway into Africa. We had done our part, but we also understood that this was bigger than us, and other African nations needed to get involved. And so we launched the Beyond the Return. Unfortunately, conveniently, it seems, COVID came in and put a halt and stop to all that momentum. And so just to recap, as I close, one thing that I want us, through that quick story, focusing in on, the cause of how it led up to this, but also the conditions of Ghana and the state of Ghana and its position, and why the Year of Return was so successful in that space and leading to the effects of how it happened. But also understanding that, that situation is quite unique in and of itself, and all African nations have its own uniqueness in how they're going to approach this sort of reconciliation process and their purpose in this space. So one thing I will say is that, when we're willing to accept the responsibility as African nations that are taking on this responsibility of making sure that there is a reconciliation process from whatever spaces and countries that we come from in Africa, we also have to understand that sometimes that responsibility also is accompanied with a sense of guilt. And that guilt, African countries would have to hold and really nuance in order to make space for true reconciliation. And that's something that I think a lot of African countries, even though our people have always been Pan-African in spirit, what oftentimes distinguishes Ghana from other countries is that we have the government understanding its responsibility and holding that sense, not willing to be able to hold that guilt and nuance the conversation and be in the front lines. And I think that's something that we must encourage other African governments to take on, and then look at their own context, not necessarily trying to duplicate the year of return, but see what works for them. Because as I said, the fact of the matter is that majority of enslaved Africans that actually did not come from Africa. They came from these other spaces. And so these African countries, definitely, it's their duty to take on this responsibility. And from a theological space, again, I'm always going to go back to a kind of the spiritual implications of Pan-Africanism and what it actually really means. When we do come together, I always believe that, the spirit is always, the universe is always on the side of justice once the oppressed folks come together. And so there are some real, from a theological term, eschatological possibilities that come from it. And so it's not just the social, political, and social economic that we consistently focus in on, but there's some real spiritual and eschatological possibilities from our reconciliation as well. And so that's what I would have to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Brother Buhari.